For a few years now, we have had a series of programs and research and publications that have been focused on a central theme of the role of Israel in American foreign policy. And more specifically, what Israel brings to the U.S. Israel relationship. It is well known what America brings to the U.S. Israel relationship. Living in Washington, we can all look at the sort of foreign aid that America brings to the relationship, the military assistance that America brings to the relationship. This is well known. What is much less well known is what Israel brings to the U.S. Israel relationship. The contributions that Israel makes, not only to its own defense, but to overall American strategic interests in the Middle East and even more broadly. The basic idea that Israel is a contributor to American interest shouldn't be so novel. It shouldn't be such an outlandish concept when one looks at the enormity of the relationship and the great variety and depth of contributions that Israel makes. But in fact, it is. It is an idea that is remarkably controversial. It is an idea that is remarkably and strangely, in many venues, counterintuitive. Now, for a research organization like the Washington Institute, when one is faced with an idea that is definable, researchable, quantifiable, but yet provocative and often counterintuitive, what do? Well, we put our finest researchers to the task to actually produce the study that animates the idea. As I said, this is really the third in a series of research products that we have produced at the Institute on the basic idea of Israel's role as an asset to the United States. The first was a debate several years ago that I engaged in with Ambassador Chaz Freeman on Israel's role as asset or liability to the United States. Then, 2 years ago, the Institute published a joint study by Ambassador Robert Blackwell and former Undersecretary of Defense Walter Slocum on Israel's role as an asset to the United States in the security realm. And then we asked our crack team of Mike Eisenstadt and David Pollock to take a broader look and a deeper dive into the quite kaleidoscopic breadth of Israel's role as an asset to the United States and what Israel brings to the U.S.-Israel relationship. That produced this study titled Asset Test: How the United States Benefits from Its Alliance with Israel, which is really quite a deep dive into all aspects of the hard power and soft power aspects of this relationship. If you haven't received this study, you can either find it on our website or you can pick one up on the way out. You'll also be able to pick up on the way out a handy little graphic which encapsulates the core elements of the findings of this study in a single, what is this, about 11 by 17 or so graphic, which looks again at both the hard power and soft power aspects of the relationship. You'll hear more about this from our speakers in just a minute, and you'll be able to pick one of these up on your way out as well. So today, we're going to hear from Mike Eisenstadt and Dave Pollock, and then we're going to hear from two very special guests. First, a word about Mike and David. Mike Eisenstadt is the director of the Institute's Military and Security Program. He's been I think, the longest-serving fellow on our staff. Goes back with me quite some years.
Sounds ominous.
Sounds ominous. And we have been, I think we and the entire Washington policy community have benefited greatly over Mike's many years here from his really incisive research on a broad variety of issues, not just U.S. Israeli strategic cooperation, but issues relating to dealing with Iran, Syrian chemical weapons. If you look on our website and you see the breadth of Mike's expertise, it's really, really quite impressive, and very delighted to have Mike running our military and security program. Sitting next to Mike is Dr. David Pollack. David wears a number of hats here at the Institute. He has written broadly on issues relating to Arab public opinion, Middle East public opinion, the author of several studies, including the original path-breaking study on the question of the Arab street. Dave has also written on Kurdish politics, Kuwaiti politics. He is the director of our Fikra Forum, which brings together Arab voices in a near real-time blog with English-speaking voices, Washington policy-making voices, to create a virtual conversation on the tumultuous events going on in the Middle East over the last 2 years and ongoing today. And we're very happy that you could devote your efforts to this. And then joining David and Mike on the podium today are two very special guests, people who bring firsthand experience and knowledge of the depth of the U.S.-Israel relationship in a variety of fields. First will be Mr. Greg Slater. Mr. Slater is the Director of Trade and Competition Policy at Intel Corporation. In that position, he's responsible for managing Intel's presence here in Washington and the company's directors of health, IT, education, workforce policy, immigration, and legal policy. Previously, he served as the Group General Counsel for Intel's Corporate Services Division. And prior to that, he managed the legal aspects of Intel's environmental health and safety issues worldwide. And he brings a really fascinating understanding of the global operations of a major player like Intel and the role that Israel plays in contributing to that industry. Secondly, we'll hear from Dr. Stephen Phillips. Dr. Phillips is the Director of Specialized Information Services and the Associate Director of the National Library of Medicine at the National Institutes of Health here in Bethesda. Deeply engaged in disaster relief, disaster response. The center which he directs is totally devoted to disaster informatics. It is the first of its kind in the world. Dr. Phillips has quite an illustrious background in medicine. I'll just note that way back in 1967, he was on the team that implanted the first balloon pump in a human and performed the first heart transplant here in the United States. And since then, he has devoted a career to public health and disaster response, and he brings a unique insight into the relationship between the United States and Israel in an important aspect of public life. So first we'll hear from Mike and David, and then turn to Mr. Slater and Dr. Phillips. Gentlemen.
Thanks, Rob, and good afternoon, everybody. David and I are going to start with a wave-top overview of our findings, the findings of our study, before we move on to our guests, who are really, I think, the main show today as practitioners and people who could provide kind of a first-hand perspective on the subject we're looking at. But I just thought I would start with some comments about why we did this study. And I think what's interesting, when we first got started on this, it was clear that there really hadn't been a study done since the Cold War that looks at the strategic rationale for the U.S.-Israel relationship. Now, I think the strategic benefits of the U.S.-Israel alliance were well understood during the Cold War, at a time in which Israel was often seen as a bulwark against Soviet influence and radical Arab nationalism. Today, however, the strategic benefits, I think, are less well understood, and for a variety of reasons. I think, in part, there's a tendency to see Israel exclusively through the prism of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the peace process. And I think after 9/11, there was a tendency, even though U.S. government officials regularly talk about the intimate and intensive nature of the security relationship, there's a tendency to downplay the details because the war on terror or the war on violent extremism, whatever you prefer, required the cooperation of a number of Arab and Muslim states, and was feared that talking too much about this would harm those efforts. So part of what we're trying to accomplish here is simply bring to light, really, as Rob said, the kaleidoscopic nature of the relationship, which really is extended to encompass a broad variety of areas, and to also reframe the relationship in light of the new post-war on terror security environment. The way we think about security today is much different than the way we did during the Cold War, and encompasses many more areas than traditionally would be considered in the traditional approaches to security, and we discussed that. Now, I can't touch on all the details that we go into in our study, but I'll just kind of go over some of the highlights of the things that we address. And the first thing we look at is go top down, and we kind of look at what are the basic interests that unite the United States and Israel. And I think one of the things we concluded is that while we share many interests with many countries in the Middle East, I think Israel is probably the ally in the region whose interests are most closely aligned with the U.S. Not completely coincident, but aligned, whether it has to do with their common interest in regional stability, countering violent extremism, or preventing additional nuclear proliferation in the region. We also discuss the factors that underpin the U.S.-Israel alliance. We look at geostrategic factors, whereas during the Cold War, Israel was a bulwark against Soviet influence and Arab radical nationalism. Today, I think you could say that Israel, at least very locally, is a bulwark against the expansion of radical Islam in the territories and in Jordan, as a result of security cooperation between Israel and the PA and Jordan. And it's a U.S. ally against radical nationalist regimes such as that in Syria and radical Islamist regimes such as that in Tehran. There's also political dimensions to the relationship. In the past, in the days of Anwar Sadat, he saw a rapprochement with the U.S. as the main way to achieve progress in the peace process. And I think that was, for many years, and still to some extent is, an important rationale for the reason why many Arab countries want to have a close relationship with Washington. We looked at the peace process. We looked at non-proliferation and counter-proliferation issues. For instance, the role that Israeli preventive strikes on Iraq's nuclear program in '81 and Syria's program in 2007, the contributions those have made to American security, even though the Iraqi strike was at the time criticized by the U.S., but I think there's a different perspective today. And I think as we look at events in Syria in the last few days, I think it's clear that the things that Israel are doing also serve American interests at a time when the United States is not willing to perhaps use military force to prevent, for instance, the spread of chemical weapons into the hands of extremist groups. And then we spend a lot of time focusing on what we call hard and soft security contributions that Israel makes to American security. Hard being military security contributions, soft being non-military. Before I go into the hard security contributions, I just want to make a few points about risks and costs that the alliance has entailed for the U.S., because we've also discussed that. And clearly, we talk about the '73 war, the fact that it led to a crisis with the Soviet Union and an Arab oil embargo, the '82 Lebanon war, which led to an ill-fated U.S. intervention and the rise or the emergence of Hezbollah, and also the fact that U.S. support for Israel has contributed in some ways to the growth of anti-Americanism in Arab and Muslim societies. But we also point out that in this case, Arab anti-Americanism is also due to various other American policies. American support for authoritarian regimes, perceived anti-Muslim actions such as the abuse of prisoners at Abu Ghraib or the invasion of Iraq, and discontent with the way the United States has been waging the war on terror. But one of the things that we found is that being that as it may, U.S. support for Israel has not affected the substance of the U.S.-Arab relationship. If you look at, and this builds on really excellent work that Dave has done elsewhere, but which we incorporated into our study. If you look at trade, student enrollments, visa applications, arms sales, security cooperation, it's at an all-time high today. And we also found that since the 1973 Arab oil embargo, we could not find a single case in which U.S. requests for access, basing, or overflight rights were denied to the United States due to its support for Israel. There were other reasons on occasion, but not due to U.S. support for Israel. Now, I mentioned the hard security contributions that Israel makes to American security in the military and defense domain. And we look at intelligence sharing, counterterrorism cooperation, rocket and missile defense, military lessons learned, military-to-military relationships, defense industrial cooperation, and homeland security. Can't go into all of them now. It's in the study, but I'm just going to highlight 3 particular points. First, with regard to rocket and missile defense. It used to be a debate in Washington about the whole issue of missile defense, and there were people who were skeptical that about the idea of hitting a bullet with a bullet, as is often said. Can you really use a missile to intercept an incoming missile? Is it technically feasible, and can it be done, in an affordable way? And I think events of recent months have definitively answered that question. And I think Israel's missile and rocket defense program, which was funded to a great extent by the United States and benefited from American support, has proven that question in the affirmative, that yes, it can be done. And I think we are learning important lessons learned for our own missile defense efforts in Europe and in the Gulf, based on the Israeli experience in the recent war in Gaza. And I would just point to a policy watch by our own Eddie Box, our Air Force fellow, who wrote a piece recently, just a few weeks ago, about lessons learned for the U.S. from the war in Gaza for our missile defense efforts with our Arab allies in the Gulf. We also look at, we have a short chapter in the monograph on what we call the dogs of war, and about the use of special search dogs. Now, the U.S. has used military working dogs for decades, for many tasks, including explosive detection. But one of the things that we found in our efforts to fight IEDs in Iraq and Afghanistan, our military working dogs were working on a leash, and therefore they exposed their handlers to danger when they were looking for bombs. And unfortunately, many dog handlers were killed that way. The Israelis had a system where they trained the dogs to operate off the leash up to 100 meters from the handler, and they could take remote commands by voice or hand, and they had the commands were relayed by radio. The Israelis demonstrated that capability to the U.S. military and gave us actually a number of dogs. The problem is the dogs were trained to understand Hebrew commands. So, but we ended up sending trainers to Israel to learn the system. Well, not to learn, but to learn the system so we could train our own dogs. And it was used to great effect in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it saved a lot of lives. And we've also used the dogs based on a system the Israelis developed of using the dogs to basically conduct pre-entry reconnaissance of buildings using dog cams, little cameras on the backs of the dogs. And we adopted that system. It's now widely used, not just by the U.S., but many countries, and it saved many lives as well. And then finally, just the Israeli influence on the American way of war. We know that the 73 war had an important impact on the emergence of air-land battle. The Israeli air defense suppression campaign in the Bekaa Valley in '82 had a big impact on the way the Air Force does air defense suppression. And most recently now, the techniques that the Israelis developed to counter violent extremist groups, the targeted killings they used in the Second Intifada and the like, to a great extent have been adopted by the U.S. Military. Also, the difference was the U.S. actually was the first one to use UAVs for this, even though the Israelis were pioneers in the use of unmanned aerial vehicles. But the U.S. was the first to use the UAVs. But many of the targeting methodologies were based on methodologies, the integration of human sources, all sources, breaking down stovepipes between, in Israel's case, the Shin Bet and Israeli military intelligence, to integrate their activities and to close the targeting loop to minutes. It used to take the Israelis a day to do this. At the beginning of the Intifada, at the end of the Intifada, they were doing it it took them 15 minutes to close the loop. And we've adopted a lot of those techniques, for better or for worse, because I know this is a controversial issue in the United States. I will close. I'm going to hand over to Dave now to talk about soft security, but I just want to say that we also deal with future challenges, and we acknowledge that Israel will have to deal with a number of major challenges to its long-term security, economic well-being, and international standing if it is to retain its attractiveness as a U.S. ally. And we discussed these issues: peace with the Palestinians, managing tensions, reducing mistrust with the United States, most recently over differences regarding peace process stuff and policy towards Iran. Economic and educational challenges, the growing socioeconomic gaps in Israel and shortcomings in their educational system, surprisingly. Demographic challenges, the challenges of delegitimization, and then finally Iran's nuclear program. And we end, I think perhaps maybe somewhat optimistically, saying that when you look back and look at the challenges that Israel has overcome in the past, in managing or surmounting challenges related to mass immigration, deep social cleavages, hyperinflation and economic stringency, war and terror, it provides reason for optimism that they will find ways to manage or solve many of these problems. So I will conclude on that point, and I look forward to, Dave, it's yours, and tell us about the soft security stuff. Thank you.
Thanks very much again. I'm going to talk about soft security, which is mostly about economics and technology, and the way in which I think the U.S. and Israeli partnerships in those areas contribute to the United States and to Israel. It's a two-way, a symbiotic relationship. In order to do that, I want to first put this in perspective and spend just a moment talking about how big or how small Israel's economy and Israel's technology sectors really are. And what I found in doing the study, and this actually surprised me, I learned quite a lot that I never thought I would have to learn, but I did from doing the study. What surprised me is that Israel is no longer the poor or even middle-income small country that I at least grew up thinking it was. Israel, in fact, is a country today of 8 million people with an economy and a standard of living that qualifies it to join the OECD, the club of the top 25 advanced industrial economies in the world. It's a country that provides a larger market for U.S. exports in the last 7 years than Saudi Arabia, which is often thought of as a fabulously wealthy and certainly is a much bigger country. And yet Israel buys more from the United States than Saudi Arabia does over the past 7 years. This is not a statistical fluke, it's a fact. Israel is a country that in 2009 became one of the top 20 foreign investors, FDI, foreign direct investors, in the United States, in the world. It's a country that provides the United States and Americans in the high-tech sector and other advanced sectors of the economy with 1/4 to 1/2 as many joint patents, joint scientific papers, and skilled high-tech professional workers. 1/4 to 1/2 as many in all of those categories come from Israel each year to the United States as come from Germany, which is an economic and technological powerhouse with 10 times Israel's population. Of the $3 billion annually that the United States gives Israel for military support, $2.25 billion comes right back to the United States each year to buy American weapons. That's fairly well known, I think. But what's more important, and I'll just end with this, to put this economic relationship and economic partnership in perspective is this. That $2.25 billion that Israel spends each year from American taxpayer funds to buy American weapons from American companies, that amounts to 5%, 1/20th of total U.S.-Israeli trade each year. So today, when people talk about dependence or when people talk about a tiny Israel or things like that, it's way, way out of date. And the facts, I think, that I just presented, and there are many more in the monograph if you want to look them up, speak for themselves. Now that's the big picture. Let me talk very briefly about some niche areas where I think Israel makes a special contribution and has a special value added in soft security areas with the United States, or to the United States. And I'm not going to talk about IT hardware or about medicine, because we have people here on the panel who know much more about that than I do, and we'll talk to you about that in just a few moments. I'm going to focus on a few other niche areas very briefly. One is cybersecurity, where I think most of you have heard or have read the press reports, the leaks about Stuxnet and Olympic Games and all those sorts of things that, in which Israel and the United States, according to these reports, partnered in offensive cyber operations against Iran's nuclear program. But I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about something that is not headline material, not sensational, but really important for the American economy and for American technology and for the security of the cyber network that everything we do these days depends critically upon. And that is Israel's advanced technology in cyber defenses, in protecting critical infrastructure, banking transactions, electrical grids, and so on, from cyber attack. Israel, of course, is subjected to probably more cyber attacks than any country in the world, and it has had to, as it has in other areas, develop ways to cope with this and preempt these attacks. And in many of these areas, whether it's financial transactions here in the United States or critical infrastructure protection, it's U.S. Israeli partnerships, American and Israeli private sector companies, not government agencies for the most part, working together to meet these challenges. I'm going to give you just one example from my own family. It so happens that one of my sisters is an executive, the director of operational security, whatever that means, at an Israeli-founded company, which was recently bought by Cisco for $5 billion. This company, just this year, this company has 5,000 employees, so by my advanced mathematical calculation, that's $1 million of investment for every single employee that the company has. There must be a lot of value added there. And the value added is that this is the company with its major R&D facilities in Jerusalem that provides encryption for most of the world's satellite and cable TV transmissions and secure video conferencing. This is not headline stuff, right? It's not going to be an explosion someplace or major strategic, quote-unquote, development, but it's important. And it's in areas like this where Israel-U.S. cooperation in cybersecurity really makes a difference. Another area is energy. And it's not, I think, here again, it's not the sensational or the headline stories that you might read about Israeli natural gas prospects, which are significant in the longer term, or about battery-operated cars, Better Place, or companies like that, which actually aren't doing so well in the market. It's actually things like solar electricity generation, in which Israeli technology is making a significant contribution to U.S. energy diversity and U.S. economic success. It's an Israeli company that has already built the largest U.S. solar thermal electricity generating plant ever, by far. And it's called BrightSource, and it operates in the desert in California. And it produces a very significant amount of electricity in a very efficient and obviously very environmentally friendly way. Unfortunately, I have to say, parenthetically, Israel has not managed to figure out how to use this technology in its own country nearly as well as it exports it to other countries and partners with American companies and American municipalities and public works systems in order to make this reality come true. Societal resilience is another niche area. Very, very briefly, it's worth noting that Israel, as Mike mentioned also, has managed to build this thriving economy and thriving high-tech sector in the face of constant security threats, ranging from terrorism to rockets, and today to the threat of much larger conflagrations in the region. And it has managed to do so in a way that preserves its social capital, that keeps people feeling confident enough to go to work every day and go to school every day and continue to provide this high standard of living and high quality of technology and high value added to its international partners. And I remember hearing, if you don't mind my alluding to this, Greg Slater say at another presentation about a year ago that his company, which has major manufacturing and research facilities in Israel, and you'll hear more about that in a few moments, has never had one day of work stopped or lost because of any of the wars or any of the terrorist incidents or any of the rockets or missiles that Israel has been subjected to. And Israel has something, this is not just something that Israel does, it's something that it is transferring through a very extensive network of joint workshops, seminars, partnerships, and so on with the U.S. government and with the U.S. private sector, is transferring to the United States so that we can better cope with potential dangers in that area. Water security. Israel is the world leader in drip irrigation and has captured, amazingly, for a country of its size, it has captured 50% of the entire global market in drip irrigation technology, including a very, very large production facility also in California. The company is called Netafim. If you look on their website, you won't see that it's an Israeli company, but it is. And that's in order for it to be able to do business in Muslim countries and other countries that don't have good or any diplomatic relations with Israel all over the world. 50% of the global market in this important technology, not just for economic reasons, but for sustainability and humanitarian reasons, irrigation drip technology, is in Israel's hands in partnership with American companies and producers. Wastewater recycling, again, not a big headline issue, but Israel is the world leader in this area. 80% of Israel's wastewater is recycled. The second country on this list is Spain, with about 30%. And finally, in this area, desalination. Israel is one of the world leaders, not number one, but number 4, as it happens, in reverse osmosis desalination technology, which uses less energy and is friendlier to the environment than other major technologies in water desalination. And again, here, it's not just for Israel's sake that this is happening. Israel today, I mean almost literally today, this is from a newspaper headline just a few days ago, Israel, an Israeli company, is building the largest reverse osmosis desalination plant in the United States ever, outside of San Diego, which will, in a few years, probably provide most of that whole area's drinking water. What can I say by way of conclusion? What would I like you to take away from this very brief presentation before I turn it over to our other more expert panelists? I would say 3 things. What we're trying to do in this study is not so much to talk about Israel as a startup nation, to use the famous phrase and title of a book from about 5 years ago, because that was about what Israel does for itself and how good Israel is in innovation. What we're trying to do in this study is the next step, which is to say, okay, that's good for Israel, but what's in it for us? How does all of that innovation and all of that technology and entrepreneurship benefit the United States in partnership with Israel? And so I think that we have provided some important examples of exactly that, that go far beyond just this notion of a startup economy inside Israel itself. Second, this is not just about Israel being a leader in certain areas per capita, as you may often see in discussions of issues like this, because it is a small country, after all. In some areas, in some of these niche areas that I just talked about, Israel is not only a leader per capita, it's just plain a leader in the world for any country of any size, anywhere. And because of the historic connections and the personal connections and the strategic interests that bind the U.S. and Israel together, and because, frankly, of Israel's lack of opportunities in some other countries or other parts of the world. It's that leadership that the Israelis take to the United States and to American companies to work in partnership in order to benefit both countries. And finally, this is not just about the U.S.-Israeli relationship. I think that in some of these niche areas, and we go into this in more detail in our monograph, in some of these niche areas, U.S.-Israeli partnership has spin-off global benefits, in the sense that what the Israelis can do in agriculture or aquaculture or water sustainability or alternative energy sources is often used in partnership with the United States in international development programs that support the livelihood of people in faraway countries in Africa or Asia or Latin America, and support the American foreign policy objectives of building a more developed, a more equitable, a more sustainable global economy. And I'm going to mention one area in conclusion where this partnership is in operation today, and it's one where Israel, like some of its Muslim majority neighbors, has a sort of a comparative advantage. And don't laugh, it's circumcision. This is an area in which Israeli technology and Israeli doctors and Israeli programs are partnering with the United States and with the UN and with African countries and even with some predominantly or partly Muslim countries in order to conduct a vast program of adult circumcision, 20 million people in the next 10 years, as a preventive measure against the spread of the AIDS virus. And this is one area, not a trivial one, I would submit, in which Israel's advantages in technology and partnership with the United States and with other countries provides benefits not only or even mostly to Israel, but to the other countries that it works with as well. Thank you.
So I'm not going to be as exciting as the prior speakers because I'm not going to talk about missiles or nuclear reactors or dogs that speak Hebrew, or I'm going to talk about high tech. And I'm going to give you some facts, and I realize a couple of you have listened to this presentation before about a year ago, so I'm going to try and add some new color commentary to it. And I'm going to talk about Intel's relationship with Israel. We have a number of design centers in various locations in Israel that design and also development centers that design and develop different technologies, and we'll go through those in a minute. And we have some big manufacturing plants in Kiryat Gat. And it's just amazing what has happened. And hopefully I'll be able to convey that to you, the contribution that Israeli engineers have done for us. So slide 2. And I'm going to go through these facts quickly because I want to really add the color to it. Here's our payroll. You'll see that the purple, the key is up above. The purple in manufacturing, you see the crossover between development and manufacturing that happened several years ago. That's an important thing to keep in mind because on manufacturing, Israel really imports our process technology that's developed in Oregon. They help, but it's not truly their innovation. They contribute to it. On development, the Israeli teams have come up with a lot of innovations that I'll go through. Next slide. So this is just some figures on how much we contribute to the economy. Now, we mentioned exports of weapons. Well, actually, Israel buying weapons to the tune of whatever it was. Well, we're exporting 2.2 billion every year. In fact, press reports had it much higher. Some of these figures, by the way, are based on 2011. We're going to update them in a couple of months. We have to be careful what we disclose publicly. So, sorry I couldn't update the slides. Next month, they'll be a little bit more updated. Next slide. So this is our investments in Israel. Technology costs more and more with each new process technology because it's more complicated. You get 2 billion transistors on a little piece of silicon like this, and the machines to make it are very, very expensive, $30 to $50 million a piece for the more advanced tools. and there's hundreds of tools and the resources to develop the chemicals and so forth. And so this figure actually will go up a lot higher. And one interesting comment by the outgoing director of Investment Protection Center, he said, Intel, our investment, our being Israel's investment in Intel, has paid off handsomely for the economy, showing just the card that Intel is in Israel has helped attract a lot more venture companies. You know that there are more venture companies in Israel than just about anywhere else, or per capita. It's incredible what has happened there. Next slide. So what is the story? What are the innovations and the products and so forth? The latest and greatest is the Israeli design team has designed our two most recent microprocessors, the Ivy Bridge and the Sandy Bridge, the most complicated processors in the world, frankly. They came up with the design. It was based on an earlier design that was revolutionary, just adding nuances to it to make it work even better on a smaller piece of silicon. And this is the next slide, is where I want to take you. They actually designed the very first microprocessor that put Intel on the map, the 8088 microprocessor in 1979 that IBM chose, if some of you may remember this, came out with the first desktop personal computer, and that had the Intel processor that a design team in Israel put together. And they've designed a number of other products. The one I really want to focus on, though, that illustrates the partnership between Israel and the U.S. inside Intel, and more broadly, the different cultural elements that produce this unique economic partnership is back on the prior slide, is right here in 2003, when Israeli engineers realized we were running up against a power wall, and there was too much heat. The way we were successful is to develop faster and faster processors. And they realized that pretty soon we were going to have a little nuclear reactor inside the processor unless we change the architecture. And Israeli engineers were very well aware of this, were the first ones to realize it, and flew back and forth between Israel and Santa Clara for months to try and convince the top executives at Intel that we needed to change the architecture and not look at speed so much as the way the engine worked, developing more pistons, if you will. So eventually the car would go faster, but at lower speeds, if that makes any sense. And the current CEO, Paul Alini, was in charge of the mobility group and turned them down. And they just kept coming back and knocking on doors and stalking executives in the hallways. And eventually they saved the company, because eventually the executives were persuaded with the data and the persistence and made what's called the right-hand turn. And the whole architecture of the microprocessor changed. We developed the first microprocessor design for laptops that allowed laptops to be what they are without a big fan in them. And now we're going to even thinner laptops. It's all based on that first design in 2003. And through that, a lot about Israeli culture came out. 3 of our values, risk-taking, results orientation, and constructive confrontation, are on my Intel badge, actually 2 of those. Well, Israel is like Intel on steroids. They take that literally. And, one of the guys who made those trips every month, who is now an executive VP of the mobile group, right, took Paul Alini's place, said, I took an American executive over to Israel, and we were arguing in this room, and there were red faces and shouting, and the U.S. executive got out. He said, what's going on here? And he said, it was a good meeting. We came out with good conclusions. And that confrontation has produced these innovations. And it really is consistent with Intel culture, but taking it to the next level to produce all these innovations. So next slide. This is Intel Israel again, developing WiDi. I don't know if you've heard that. That's where you can stream videos and so forth from your laptop to your TV. Next slide. And this is Thunderbolt technology. It's a technology that allows rapid transmission of huge chunks of data, which will be very important as we continue to accelerate content development. And you have all these devices communicating with each other. Next slide. And now Intel design engineers are moving into the software space big time. That's the next frontier for us to develop holistic solutions, not just chips. And they are developing, they're really focusing on security enhancements and visual computing, being able to tell your computer what to do just by looking at it or by talking to it, those kind of things. And they will be here sooner than we think. So this is big stuff, and it will be very interesting. And the touch and the feel and all that stuff. You know, Apple is there, but we're going to eventually go way beyond what Apple has done with the phone. And there's some really neat technology advancements going on that will be not just for our field, but will permeate other fields as well. There will be many, many applications to these developments. Next slide. This is identity protection, where instead of having 18 passwords, you know, you can just look at something in iris recognition or fingerprint recognition and be able, you are the password, right, with all your devices. That will be really nice, because I can't remember, do I add a 1, an exclamation mark on this one, or do I add 2 zeros? It's just really, really frustrating. And then you have to refresh those passwords, and then you have a sequence that you use, and you're not sure if you, anyway, so you know, you get the pin. Okay, next slide. This is just, you know, they are very strong. Our Intel folks are very strong on manufacturing. They've won lots of awards, and they've added a lot to manufacturing. They have one of the most advanced factories in the world in Israel. I don't want to diminish manufacturing, but I think where they really, really shined is where they've had complete control over an area and shown what they can do in collaboration with the resources of the mothership to really push forward our technology. This is interesting and important. So it's not just all about Intel, right? People leave Intel, they take their know-how with them, they take the experience that they got, and they go and start their own companies, and they develop their own technologies. And so you see some of the figures here. Where is that figure? Well, we invest in Israeli companies, and you know, a lot of them leave and deal with their own companies. Oh, that's a busy slide. I'll have to fix that. Okay, next slide. And this is just the outfall of what happens in the industry, the multiplier effect that you've heard of, right? Next slide. That's it. So I want to give back a little time to you. Thank you.
Well, great. Thank you. Thank you. I have to say, I work for the federal government, so what you hear are my opinions, not the opinion of the government. And I'm from the government. I'm here to help you. So. What was said was just so appropriate, and it also applies to health science and medicine. And what I want to do in the time allotted to me is kind of just give you the 30,000-foot view of what's been going on, and then talk about some personal experiences in working with Israel. I will say from the onset is that we get more health information, technology, health science from Israel than we provide to Israel. I mean, it's a two-way street, obviously, but I think we are getting a better flow of traffic than we are providing. You know, some examples of, as David Pollock and the others pointed out, Israel is not a small, struggling country. In the area of health science, Israel ranks 4th in the number of scientific publications in the world. When you think about that for a minute, that's pretty impressive. 4th in the world. I mean, you have the U.S., you have Canada, you have Britain, Germany, France, on and on and on, 4th. And scientific publications are not just something you write for Costco magazine. They're peer-reviewed publications in order to get into the journals. So that's quite significant. Next slide, please. There are a number of different agreements over the years between the U.S. scientific community and the Israeli scientific community. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples, because otherwise we'd be here all week and most of us would be falling asleep, including me. But President Clinton in 1993 signed an agreement and initially funded $30 million for a high-tech exchange mission with Israel. And this is not just a add-on small program. I mean, it's co-chaired by the U.S. Secretary of Commerce and Israel's Minister of Industry and Trade. So, and it also very wisely includes a high-level panel of private and university folks. So it's all-encompassing. It's well done. Next one, please. This is something that goes back to 1985. An MOU between the Department of Health and Human Services, the folks that pay my salary, and the Israeli Ministry of Health. And I won't read all these things, but it's very obvious that it provides for an information exchange of scientific, personnel, information, and even administrative activities, education and training, health services research. I mean, it's all encompassing. It's just not an afterthought related to let's get together and help each other. Information systems, and we know how important that is in healthcare. On and on and on. Next one, please. I think most of people in the room know about Technion. I mean, the infrastructure of that started in 1912, while the land that it's on right now is still part of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, just think about that. It's kind of, you know, mind-boggling. And it just has grown over the years through many different efforts. I believe it was around 1979 it established a medical school. I mean, it's a very, very robust medical school. It's designed to admit American students. The courses are in English. And these graduate students, about 300 a year, come back to the U.S. So we'll talk about which direction things are going. I mean, these are subtle. As David said, we're not going to see headlines about this, and you're not going to hear this over dinner conversations. But not only does it have an American medical school, it has very robust associations with our universities, Harvard, Johns Hopkins. Next slide, please. Even particular hospitals where they have exchanges at every level. When I was in practice, I practiced cardiac surgery for nearly 30 years in Iowa. We had a continuous flow of international students, but the Israelis who came over. In fact, we would hire as many as we could to stay in the U.S. and run some of our programs. And in turn, I've had many trips over to Israel as visiting professor and bring things back and forth. So the exchange is at a level that's fairly subtle, which means it works. It doesn't have to be mandated. New York State has an agreement and funds student tuitions in some of these in the U.S. medical schools. So the levels are very deep and very significant. Next one, please. Conferences are a no-brainer. I mean, they're going on constantly, whether you want to just have a trip to Israel or if you want to learn something. I mean, again, I don't want to be redundant, but it's at every level. I mean, even the U.S. and medical researchers, military-wise, collaborate, of course. I mean, there are so many lessons learned related to that. We recently had a conference called the IPRED 2, International Conference on Healthcare Systems, Preparedness and Response for Emergencies and Disasters. Dr. David Siegel, who's in the audience, one of my colleagues, and I'll say a little bit more about David. We attended with a group. We put on a mini session. Our Assistant Secretary of Health for Preparedness and Response was a keynote speaker. So again, the connections are very significant and very robust. Next slide. Personally, I'm going to talk about some personal experiences now. We work closely with the Gertner Institute. I don't know if anybody is familiar with the Gertner Institute. Specifically with Dr. Kobe Peleg, and it's the National Center for Trauma and Emergency Medicine Research. I mean, they do very, very interesting things. Lessons learned for us. I'll just give you one example. They recently published a paper on resource utilization. They compared the resources needed for the automobile accidents and the patients that suffer from an automobile accident compared to the injuries related to a terrorist attack. Now, the number of automobile accidents are much greater than terrorist attacks. I think the paper talked about, they looked at 35,000 automobile accidents and what resources were needed for that versus the 2,500 or so terrorist attacks and what resources were needed for that. Well, of course, it's intuitive to know that the resources needed for a terrorist attack are much, much greater than the resources for an automobile accident, for many, many reasons, obviously. But these are lessons learned which the U.S. hasn't quite got a handle on, and we need to, and we're learning from this. But it's interactions like this that help us. Of course, we work bidirectionally. I'll show you the next slide. We work closely with the Israelis on technology and tools for first responders. This is just a screenshot of something that I want to show you. This is called the digital pen, the first arrow. It looks like a pen, writes like a pen, but also Wi-Fi's the information that you write on your triage form to the hospital, the emergency room, or a server that you decide to set up anywhere. That's something in development. The Israelis, I know, will improve upon it. It needs to be hardened, and there are other aspects of it that need to be improved. Radio frequency ID tags. Again, this is the way you can track patients that move to different places. It's a research project, but we use this. We drill with this, and we recently used it at a realistic counterterrorism conference in San Diego. Worked with a movie studio and Navy SEALs and SWAT people and had real-life examples using blanks, but used that. And something called the Lost Person Finder, which is simply using your smartphone to take a picture of a victim right there. And that's transmitted to a central database. And you can use whatever. We deployed this to Haiti very early when, unfortunately, there were just mass graves being developed, and we were able at least to take pictures of people for future identification. Next slide, please. Just a very quick example of how this pen works, because the Israelis are very involved in this. You have a mass casualty. Patient data is recorded with a digital pen on a triage form. And by the way, the software will allow you to print any form that you want on your office printer. So it's not like you have to adopt some special form. I mean, it's very interesting. It's very unique. The digital pen transmits the data to a computer network, and it can go to any receiving hospital. It'll also give you a summary and, you know, all the things that computerization and software does. And we're working on trying to harden the pen. I want to have a light put on it. I also want to try and incorporate a camera, so we don't have to have a separate camera for the first responders or the medics or whatever. So, next slide, please. This is our research form. As a physician, I would never really use this in the field, but it's just comprehensive and it covers a lot of different areas, so it helps research. Next one. This is the Israeli form. So we couldn't translate it. They said, translate your form into Hebrew for us. I said, I can't do that. I mean, you do it. Ask the dog. So yeah, I asked the dog. Well, so there we are with this. Next one, please. We also do things like guidance for responders and receivers. And I'll just very quickly go through this. Something called WISER, Wireless Information System for Emergency Responders. This has been around for quite a while, developed at the NIH at our institute. It assists first responders and first receivers in hazardous material accidents, chemical spills, whatever, and so forth. There have been probably close to 400,000 downloads on this. And then there's a similar thing for radiation, for a nuclear attack, for a nuclear spill, for a dirty bomb accident, and so forth. And chemical hazards, emergency medical management, is a step beyond WISER. It's more specific for chemicals and chemical warfare agents. So I'm showing you this for a reason for the next slide. In July, I took a little vacation. I was in Aspen, Colorado. Tough place to be in July. On a Friday night, one of my staff called me. Click the button, please. The hits on this chemical Webwiser tripled in 2 days, late July, July 28th, 29th. So I said, where did they come from? They said, well, we're not supposed to look at where these things come from. I said, no, just fine. Tell me where they came from. Well, they came from 2 IP addresses near the Syrian-Turkish border. Well, we knew what was going on. The chemical weapons were being moved around and yada, yada, yada. So I said, gee, that's interesting. So I called a couple of people that I know that have 3-letter initials. And in different agencies, one said, and it won't be a surprise, well, we don't need to know about it. We don't want to talk to you. But the other one says, no, it's under our radar. And I also called the White House security people and said, no, we hadn't heard about this. I said, well, I just thought I'd let you know. I mean, there's no downside to letting you know. Well, next slide. Next slide. Well, in the fall, I mean, this is a continuum. In the fall, we know that they've been mixing some of these gases, and specifically mustard, sarin, and VX. Mustard, you know, and sarin and VX are nerve agents. So, next slide, please. Again, we passed this information back to the Israelis, and of course, they told us that their Magen David Adom, their emergency medical services, which are mostly volunteers, but about 10,000 people, because of what has been going on, and I don't know what the time frames were, they distributed these countermeasures, diazepam, which is Valium, to all of their responders in case something happened related to a nerve agent. Well, Dr. David Siegel, who I mentioned, his name is on the slide, is a subject matter expert in this area. And he immediately noticed that the dosage that they distributed was too low to be effective in a reasonable period of time if something happened. So we've been in contact with them, and the IDF knows about it. I don't know what they've done. We probably don't want to know what they've done, but the connection is robust enough that they're taking it seriously. Next slide, please. I'm sorry. I'll just say something quickly about the radiation event, because we work with the Israelis on that. Can you do the next one? This is a comprehensive resource on how to manage a radiation event, nuclear bomb, spill, and so forth. Next, you can go on. This is the Israeli translation of a dirty bomb. Next one. We drilled with them last year in Haifa on a dirty bomb. And believe me, I can tell you, I learned more from them about what to do and how to decontaminate. In fact, it was at the Ramdam Hospital up in Haifa. And I asked them, how do you, when you deploy your emergency people to respond, I mean, simple, very simple. It's like the Russians using a pencil, and we spent billions trying to develop a pen to write in space. You know that story. I said, how do you know what to deploy? I mean, whether it's an explosive, whether it's an accident, whatever. He said, we don't. The people just tell us what's going on. I mean, they come to the emergency room before we even know what happened. I mean, that's a lesson learned for the U.S. That happens all the time in the U.S. It's an auto wreck or something like that. So, next one, please. Well, I'll finish up just by saying, and again, I'm not being too specific. I just want to cover lessons learned. And again, I'm not being political about this. But in 1995, Israel redesigned its healthcare system. I mean, we know where our healthcare system is, the benefits and the not so good things about it. But in the U.S., the philosophy is providing healthcare for the individual good. Well, I mean, there's really nothing terribly wrong about that. We all like that. But in Israel, it's for the universal good. And that translates into many different things. Individual good in the United States translates into organized market forces, bottom line issues, for-profit systems. More than 50% of the physicians now in the U.S. work for someone. They don't have a practice any longer. So whatever that means, history will tell. One pet peeve that I have, because I'm in this business, is disparate IT systems. When you think about it, if you have a chest x-ray here in D.C. and then you go see your doctor back in Iowa, I mean, you can't transmit that, because every hospital, on purpose, every clinic, every system is disparate. The DOD and the VA systems, when soldiers transfer over, can't communicate with each other. I mean, again, not to politicize it, I've testified and said we have one monetary system for the United States. I think it's above capitalism. We should have one IT system. I mean, you can still make money, but anyway, the Israeli system is a lesson to be learned from us. And our Affordable Health Care Act, I think, has similar goals. Many things are one half the U.S. cost, and the outcomes are better. So I'll finish there, and thank you very much. I appreciate.
Thank you.
I appreciate the lunch because my wife is out of town.
Why don't you take a seat here? Yeah. And we're going to take questions now. But I just, to kick things off, and if you want to ask a question, just give me kind of the high sign, and I'll put together a list here. And I just would ask if you guys could answer questions up here, if you don't mind, just because of the camera is focused on the podium. You know, one of the things that just came across in the discussion, well, going back one step, one of the things that I think, you know, in studying the U.S. Israel mill relationships is the degree to which it was successful because it was isolated from politics and the vicissitudes of, you know, the ups and downs of the U.S. Israel relationship. And that's why actually the U.S. and Israel has been able to do so much in the areas of mill-to-mill cooperation, intel sharing and the like. Do politics ever intrude into, you know, what you guys do, or is this also, again, it goes on free from politics and it's not a concern, or I'm just, please, yes.
The answer is yes, but most of us as physicians and scientists ignore it. When this was advertised, my boss called me and wanted to know what's going on. I mean, I said, no, I'm just going to talk about our interactions and what we do. So there are different levels.
U.S. politics?
No, U.S. Israel and you know, and controversies related to Israel and stuff like that.
Not U.S. politics, but there are boycotts on goods from Israel, and that could potentially affect our shipments. But we haven't been affected yet. So.
Can I say one
Yeah,
thing?
sure.
I forgot to mention, the politics are not always government-wide. For example, one government policy in the previous administration when we had a moratorium on stem cell research, well, a lot of that went over to Israel quietly, and a lot was developed. Drugs to combat multiple sclerosis. On the device level, some of our big companies that are multinational but sell in the U.S. Perhaps don't develop certain technologies or machines. For example, there's a new MRI developed in Israel, just approved by the U.S. FDA, that will give a very fine, accurate diagnosis of breast and testicular cancers above and beyond, where some of the corporate folks don't, you know, they don't want to rush into some of these changes because they still have machines in inventory. So, different levels.
Why don't you stay up here, Steve? Because I'd like to initially have you guys direct questions at Steve and Greg, and once we're done with that, we'd be glad to entertain broader questions pertaining to the study. But if does anybody have any questions for our speakers here? No? Okay, yes, Doug.
I'm Doug Fife from the Hudson Institute.
And wait, if you could just wait for the mic here and just identify yourself.
I'm Doug Fife from the Hudson Institute. Greg, you mentioned the issue of boycotts. Could you talk about whether the boycott, divestiture, sanctions movement that is somewhat active in the United States but much more active in Europe has impinged on, you know, the consciousness of people at Intel or at NIH, and you know, what do you see about that?
Yeah, I actually, we have not been affected, and it has not impacted us. I mean, we're a little different in that chips are made in Israel, but then they're packaged elsewhere. So the final product is not from Israel, and I think that's helpful for us. So I don't have any other comments on that.
Yeah, I don't think there have been any boycotts that affected us. I mean, I've been invited to Iran a number of times. I haven't gone. At one time, a number of years ago, I was invited to Cuba. When I got there, they wouldn't let me in, but they invited me, but I don't understand what happened. But from our point of view, there's always approval to go and do things like that.
If there's no other questions for the guests in their presentation, we're willing to open it up to just general questions about the general topic today or the presentations or the study, if you have any questions. So, yes, ma'am. Oh, yeah. Yes, please. Okay. Sorry.
My name is Aman Hudalali. My question is, in any relationship, whether with your wife or with your girlfriend or with neighbor, if there is no problem, there is no need to talk about how good things are. Can we say that there's a problem in the relationship? That's the reason why you're talking about how great things are and how important Israel is for the United States? I mean, there are some people raising this question. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, I'll glad to start off, and if you have anything you want to add on. I mean, look, first of all, look, it is a, a few years ago, Walter Mearsheimer wrote a book about the U.S. Israel relationship, which, had a certain impact on people's thinking about the relationship and exactly what does the U.S. get out of it. And is this, relationship good for Israel? So yeah, I wouldn't say that we're kind of responding to that, because I think, as I said in the introduction, there's a tendency to almost single-mindedly focus on the Arab-Israeli conflict and the peace process as the entire universe of the U.S.-Israel relationship. And I think, first of all, it's just inherently desirable, as analysts, to just kind of put things in perspective and say, yes, that's important. That's an important part of the U.S.-Israel relationship, but it's not the entirety of it. And in fact, one of the things that we found out is that there is just so much going on that's not appreciated and doesn't kind of see in the light of day, or people within their own little world know about what's going on, but nobody's put together, kind of in a single place, a study that looks at the entire, range of relationships. And I'll just of interactions between the two countries. And I would say also, look, I mean, there's always been ups and downs in U.S.-Israel relations, going back to the 50s. And, I think we have, right now, with the current administration, you have an administration that in many ways is very supportive, but it's very clear there are areas that there are differences between the two countries because we don't have identical interests. Although, as I said before, I think our interests are generally aligned and probably more closely aligned between Israel and the U.S. than any other American ally in the region, but there are differences, and it does cause, tension and the like. And therefore, I think it's useful to have a study out here like this, which kind of provides a kind of I won't say a corrective, but kind of a broader perspective and a kind of redresses the balance in kind of the way that things are often looked at in the press, where it's looked at in such an emotional way, and it's always a crisis. And, the fact is there are crises, but there are lots of things going on below the surface that are very normal and are mutually beneficial. And yes, it's an asymmetric relationship, but, the U.S. does get a lot back for the relationship. And a lot of the stuff's going on in the scientific and technical and economic arenas occurs because of this political and strategic kind of manteau, or, kind of which, the foundation to the relationship, which, as a result, many Israelis are pro-American. They come here to study. They have deep ties to the United States. So, yeah, I mean, there's an element, in what you say. Yeah, it is responding in a bit to what's going on. But there hasn't been a study like this in more than 20 years since the Cold War, and we're in a very different world. And we thought it was useful to have something which kind of reframes the way that people look at the relationship in light of current, security, the way that. In light of the current security environment. Do you have anything you wanted to add to that, Dave? Or
Thanks. Very briefly, it's a very good question and a fair question, but I actually think that most of the news, most of the time, is about what's wrong, and that's even in our own study. We have quite lengthy discussions for a medium-sized study about the challenges and the problem areas for Israel internally, for U.S. Israeli relations, and within the region. There are a lot of uncertainties and challenges right now. But I think what we tried to do here, as Mike was saying, I think, is to provide a balance, not both the good and the bad. And actually, since most of what you hear is about strategy, diplomacy, Iran, Chuck Hagel, lobbies, other things like that, many of the things that we talk about are actually very, very important, but not so often on the front page. They may be on the front page of the business section, but not on the front page of the newspaper. And that's what we're trying to do here, is provide that added perspective that I think is a reflection of reality, not an attempt to spin reality.
And even provoke, prompted debate. That would be great. Jacques,
Oh, you've answered most of my question, but given
please,
this
if you could just wait for the mic.
given this landmark study, I mean, it's amazing that there's been no communication so far about these things internationally. I mean, could this be done with just a website with Israel, U.S. scientific cooperation that can get updated and be accessible to everybody?
Do you want to take a cut? Okay. I mean, actually, one of the things that was really kind of a surprise to me in doing this study, and I suspect David would agree, is that there's a tremendous amount of information out there. But first of all, the way it's framed, it's often framed in kind of, like he said, the kind of startup nation kind of kind of mode that isn't this great and is it fascinating? But it's not in terms of what's in it for us, in terms of how does this benefit the United States. Because a lot of times it's, this, for instance, there's a, Israeli 21C website that has all kinds of, and it comes out, I think, every day they have they send out emails about new scientific advances and progress in IT and all kinds of arenas. But it doesn't frame it in terms of, well, how does, because it's an Israeli site and it's not a policy site, but it doesn't frame it in terms of how does it benefit the U.S. So, there is a lot of stuff out there, but it's all over the place. And so we tried to just bring it together in one place and put it in a policy framework, that answers the question of, what's in it for us, And again, I don't know, did you have anything that you want to add to that?
One
Please.
quick thing about that. Sorry to have to keep jumping up and down like this for the camera, but the fact is that there are some aspects of this that, and I alluded to this very briefly in my remarks, there are some aspects of this that for various reasons, political or just ordinary business reasons, that some of the people involved or the companies involved prefer not to publicize too much. And so that, for example, I mentioned that Netafim, which is an Israeli, the leading, by far, drip irrigation company in the whole world, if you go to their website, not the Hebrew website, but the English website, or if you go to their Arabic website, you won't see that this is an Israeli company. And that's in order to minimize political issues with some of their global customers. And that's part of the reason, I think, at least on the soft security side, the economic and business side, why some of this material has not actually been very well publicized until now.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Robert Marin. I'm the Director of International Trade Policy at the Embassy of Israel here in Washington. This is a very interesting report. A lot of the soft issues that you discuss, I work on a day-to-day basis. Information about the impact that the Israeli economy has on the U.S., if you visit the blog of the commercial section of the Embassy of Israel, we try and update that on a regular basis, and we have some very interesting statistics on there. So I just recommend that you all take a look at that. And in addition, one of the ways that the U.S. Israel economic and commercial cooperation impacts the rest of the world, which I didn't hear discussed here, was the qualifying industrial zone initiatives in both Egypt and Jordan. And one comment I want to make about Egypt is that despite the ongoing crisis there, the initiative has continued to work. We've met with the Egyptians, and it's something that both countries see a great benefit for. And one third thing is the BIRD, BSF, bilateral R&D initiatives, where Israeli companies and U.S. companies are paired together, and that initiative has had, rough estimates over $8 billion of economic benefit in the U.S., tens of thousands of jobs, and it's just been a very great program. And if you're in the business world, I recommend taking a look at the programs.
Did you want to?
Yeah, I'll just say a word about Egypt and Jordan and the qualifying industrial zones, the quizzes. By the way, when I look for information about this in Arabic, I have to remind myself that it doesn't look like a real word when you see this spelled out in Arabic, quiz, but that's what they're talking about, QIZs, qualifying industrial zones. On page 32 of the study, you will find this interesting statistic. More than half of Jordan's exports to the United States in 2009, and these are the latest numbers that were available at the time we wrote the study, and 43% of Egypt's exports to the United States in 2010 came directly from the qualifying industrial zones in which Israel is a quiet partner. And so there is this benefit in these two particular cases for cooperation between Israel and the two Arab countries that have formal peace treaties with Israel and the United States. There's a trilateral, not just a bilateral, symmetry or symbiosis here. The question is this going to continue under the new Egyptian government? And so far, I agree, this new Egyptian government has not only maintained, but is actually asking to increase the level of industrial and commercial activity at the qualifying industrial zones in Egypt, knowing full well, although not advertising it. And if you look at their announcement of it, the Egyptian government's announcement of this request to the United States, the word Israel is not included in the Arabic text, but the reality is that Israel is a partner in this economic, important economic activity.
Yes, in the back there, somebody I recognize.
Among the most fascinating counterintuitive facts you mentioned was the extent of Israeli FDI in the United States.
Yes.
And how it places Israel as one of the largest investors in the United States.
Right.
Could you first give, what is the magnitude we're talking about here?
Yeah.
And then secondly, I know you can't give a specific number,
Yeah.
but what order of magnitude of jobs
Okay.
could you say, of American jobs, owe their existence to investments from Israel or knock-on effect of investments from Israel? I know I've asked you this privately, getting the specific is difficult, but just in terms of order of magnitude, what are we talking about here?
Okay, order of magnitude. On foreign direct investment, it doesn't sound like a huge number, but this was when Israel entered the top 20. And of course, the list changes every year. But when Israel entered the list of the top 20 foreign direct investors in the United States was 2009, which was the worst year of the global economic recession. So it was easier to break into that list in that year because the Israeli economy, relative to almost every other economy in the world in that year, was doing pretty well. And the absolute number was only $7 billion. That was enough. But that's in 1 year, $7 billion of Israeli foreign direct investment, Israeli money, coming into the United States to invest in stocks, equities, or direct factory investments in the United States, $7 billion. Now, jobs. Okay, we spent a lot of time, Mike and I, trying to get a solid number for this. And here's what we found. At best, you can do it state by state, and even then, it's pretty fragmentary and incomplete. But the numbers look something like this. In Massachusetts, the most complete data are for Massachusetts, where the most recent estimate as of about 2 years ago is that Israeli companies and products and licenses provided about 6,000 direct American jobs just in Massachusetts, and by the usual extrapolation to how many indirect jobs that created, or jobs that created indirectly, the figure would be somewhere between 20 and 25,000 for suppliers and transport and so on, services. In Virginia, we happen to have some pretty good numbers for Virginia. There are probably about 4,000 or 5,000 jobs directly attributable to Israeli companies, including the biggest hummus company in North America, Sabra, which is a partnership. No, most people don't know about this. It's a partnership between Strauss, a major Israeli food and agribusiness company, and PepsiCo. Okay, they have grown from they have grown to about almost $500 million a year in sales in just about a decade. And if you take Sabra Hummus and Zim shipping lines at Norfolk and a few other Tower Electronics and a few other major Israeli companies that happen to be headquartered in and operating in Virginia, you come up with probably about 4,000 or 5,000 jobs. In Georgia, there are nearly 100. I mean, it's kind of weird because why Georgia? I don't know. But in Georgia, there are nearly 100 headquarters, or at least North American headquarters, of Israeli companies. So I can't get comprehensive employment data, but you can imagine that that must be several thousand jobs. And in California, the figure is considerably higher, although it's even harder to get comprehensive data because it's such a scattered picture. So I would say that as a rough order of magnitude, that the number of American jobs that is created directly, I'm not counting about indirect effects here, by Israeli companies or licensed products and technologies in the United States has got to be well into the six figures, over 100,000. But I don't know. I can't pin it down any more precisely than that. And if anybody else can, and believe me, we spent a lot of time asking chambers of commerce and state governments and offices and so on, and Israeli offices and institutions to get us a number for this. That's the best we can do. Thanks.
I just, as a kind of a closing comment, I think it's important kind of to mention, one of the things that we've, in the course of our research, there are some areas that it's clearly that Israel, in absolute terms, makes a very significant contribution to American defense or the economy. And there are some areas, and actually probably in most areas, it's a niche contribution. But what's interesting, at least this is, I think, the way we thought about it, the areas that they often are leaders in are areas which, whether in the hard security arena, it's in areas very often that are playing a critical role in redefining the face of warfare. And in the soft security arena, it's in areas that will be particularly important for the United States' ability to deal with the soft security challenges of the future. For instance, in the soft security area, it's in IT. It's in micro irrigation and water management, high-tech agriculture, clean tech, medical devices and R&D, and public health. Again, it's not across the board necessarily, but it's very often in niche areas. But what's impressive is that very often, we see time and again, Israel punches way above its weight, and therefore makes an outsized contribution in these areas. So again, I don't want to, exaggerate and say, Israel's still a very small country, but they really punch way above their weight and make contributions that are outsized and often in niche areas that are particularly important for these areas. So on that note, I want to thank our guests for their excellent presentations, and I want to thank you all. And please don't forget, you can pick up, we have the infographic outside that you're welcome to pick up. We also have copies of the study outside, so please do pick it up on your way out, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you.